this on. Share a screen here. And okay, there we go. Got that. So we're going to be talking about God's sovereignty and hardening. And I'm breaking this into two parts, but of course, the most famous story that we have is of Moses having his heart hardened, him hardening his own heart, but then also that we see that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, right? So it's you kind of have like that blurring of the line, it's in Job we saw how it was Satan initiating a bunch of evil and bad things to Job, but that ultimately that God is portrayed, the one who's portrayed as being in control of that. And this is sort of a similar thing. And I'm kind of glad that we did some of the, especially the Trinity series, where you kind of have the blurring of the lines kind of an idea, like where it's kind of like, is this, it's not Yahweh, yet it's Yahweh, and you have that kind of, that kind of rhythm in the language, or that sort of thing where like you can see two sentences next to each other and they would seem to contradict, but they actually don't. Here's somebody, let Cherie in. So, oh, come on in. Hi. Hi, Ellie. All right. Hi, how you doing? Good, good. We just got started, so yeah. Oh, we're still on the front picture. So yeah. So we're gonna do like a recap a little bit of last time, and this time we're gonna be talking about God's sovereign as it relates to the hardening of the heart. Because we see, especially in Pharaoh, that Pharaoh's story, that his heart is hardened, that God hardens his heart, and at the same time, we also see that Pharaoh is hardening in his own heart. So we'll get a little bit more into that as we go on. So just to kind of recap from last week, we had this question: does God control evil? And it's an interesting question because you want it, like there's part of you that wants to say no because you don't want to associate God with evil, right? But then if you say no, then he's not in control. And if you say yes, then you're connecting him somehow to evil. And there's and I can see why there's a tendency not to do that. So it's a difficult question for a lot of people to kind of answer, right? But ultimately, everything is under God's control. So yes, God does control evil, and because he is sovereign and he controls everything. So even though he may not initiate evil, it may dream up like bad things to do, to people or whatever. God uses the evil that either man or Satan or other independent agents initiate, and then he orchestrates those things for his own purposes. And ultimately, it's for his glory, but he also does it for our own good. So yes, God uses everything. God uses the good that people do, and that angels do, and that sort of thing. But he also uses the bad things that either man or a fallen angel or one of the principalities and powers, and even Satan does. So he does them. He uses them for his own purposes. And so the prevailing point of view for biblical characters, especially like we see this in the story of Job, is that God is ultimately the one that they cry out to about suffering and evil. And it just shows you that, and it's the same is true with us. God is responsible in this sense, and he is the one that we and they want answers from. Job wants answers from God, and whenever we face calamity and suffering, ultimately it's God that we turn to. You know, we say, "Why is this happening to me?" Or "What did I do?" Or what did I do to deserve this? Or those sorts of things. It's the same things that Job went through. Um, and it's not that you're blaming God for directly being, causing the evil or suffering itself. You know, a lot of time, in the back of your mind, you may not think, like some people may think that God is directly punishing them or directly doing something to them. But even if you don't think that, you still feel that. You still have a sense that it's in God's hands. So that is who we go to. And as we've seen, that God never actually corrects Job on this. He doesn't, oh, let me tell you what's actually going on here, Job. So the prevailing point of view is that Job, his friends, and even the narrator, um, uh, we see is that God is behind Job's suffering, or that he is there. So God does not correct any of them on this point. Never does that in the story. Rather, God re-emphasizes his sovereignty. He doesn't even really give Job a reason for his suffering. He just emphasized, wait a minute, Job, like you are accusing me of being unjust, but you don't even know what's going on, and I am sovereign. And he pretty much leaves it at that. Um, we saw this one in Isaiah 45:7. We even see a verse that says, I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and I create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. So God does take responsibility for these things. And we even saw another kind of explicit time in 1 Samuel 19:9, when Saul kind of like becomes a crazy man, right? It says, then a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul. In the old King James and some other version, it says, an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul. And it sounds funny to us, an evil spirit from the Lord. You think an evil spirit from Satan. Well, it's a destructive or a harmful spirit. But either way you look at it, uh, this spirit causes Saul to kind of be crazy, but also try to kill David. So you're thinking, well, was God trying to kill David? No. Like God knew, that the sword would miss. But whatever God was doing there, He was in control of it, and maybe He didn't conjure up some evil spirit to go, hey, go bug Saul, but He handed Saul over to that. We don't know the behind the scenes on that, but we do know, but the again, the prevailing um, uh, uh, the line of thought in the Bible is that God controls everything. So these things are things that the Lord is involved in and controlling. Now, one of the points we had talked about was the handing over. Okay, that God hands over people to things. So, although we sometimes get to see who or what is behind the evil and calamity that occurs in Scripture, still God is portrayed as presiding over it. Quite often, the portrayal is that God's hand hands over someone to evil or the evil will of an enemy. And sometimes this is a result of people's sin. Usually, when we think of like God handing somebody over to something, it's because they are, they are they are practicing in their lusts or something, or some kind of sin, and then God just hands them over to it. We have some of that in Romans 1. But sometimes this is not the case. For example, well, here's an example of somebody being handed over because of sin would be Israel is handed over to their enemies because of their disobedience. Job, who's the innocent person in the story, is actually handed over into Satan's hands, right? And we see, like in Daniel 7 and in Revelation, that even the saints of God are handed over to the Antichrist, and they go through tribulation. So, so it doesn't necessarily mean that God doesn't only hand over people to to things because they're being punished. Sometimes, whatever God's plans are, it's whatever happens, it's because God has His plans for it. So sometimes the evil are handed over to their own sin. Sometimes the disobedient are handed over to an enemy. And sometimes the innocent are handed over for the purposes of testing, for example. We saw that Jesus, like is led out to the desert to have all these conversations, be tempted by Satan, So it's God is even handing over His own Son. He even hands over His own Son to crucifixion and the cross. So God will hand over sometimes people that He loves, but it's all to His own purposes. In all cases, God is sovereign, and in all cases, God is involved. So here's the segue to what we're going to talk about today. It it's in this handing over motif that seems to play a part in God sometimes hardening God's someone's heart. Okay, God sometimes hardening somebody's heart, and we're going to talk about Pharaoh today, and we're going to take some other examples outside of the story of Pharaoh next week. Um, but it doesn't. There's the term handing over doesn't really occur in the book of Exodus, but you can see the pattern that is emerging through the story. And because we're also going to see that Pharaoh is just as much hardening his own heart. It's just as much. They both seem to be the same thing, and we'll look at the language a little bit more carefully. So let's look at the story of God's hardening of Pharaoh's heart, since this is the most prominent example of God hardening someone. It's the one that we remember the most. So in Exodus 4, when God introduces Pharaoh to Moses to the idea that he's going to go to see the Pharaoh, he tells them this. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Um, just kind of as a side note, I have put in your power is interesting because we know it's the power of God, but he's giving it to Moses, but it's God, but it's Moses. This is kind of another one of those themes where the lines are blurred. For example, when he's at the Red Sea, this is a side note. This is not part of our lesson or anything, but when you know and God, Moses starts praying to God, and he's like, "What are you doing standing there? Lift up your staff and part the sea." It's so God's like saying, like I put it into your hand to do this sort of thing, but we know it's God. So we see a number of different areas in which these lines are kind of being blurred. Okay, so the way that this is introduced to Moses is that God is saying that He is going to harden Pharaoh's heart. That's how the whole thing gets introduced. We don't have that term that God hardened Pharaoh's heart again until later. I believe it's the boils. So you're going to start seeing that like so like this is like a summary. It is kind of like an overview. I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. Then we're going to see that Pharaoh either hardens his own heart, or we see kind of like a term where Pharaoh's heart became hard, or if he was hardened, right? And then we don't, but then when you get near to the end and starts recapping a little bit, then you're going to go return more to the theme again of, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So it seems to be a progression, but it's almost like a blanket statement, then you see how it happens, and then it gets re-emphasized that God did this all. Okay, so and I've got like a page where I kind of recap that. So in Exodus 7, he says again, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, and the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. I I emphasize judgment here because even though it's Pharaoh is responsible. Okay, this is a judgment on Pharaoh, and it's a judgment on the people that are hardening their hearts. Actually, right? So it's not as if like I'm going to harden his heart. There's nothing he can do about it, and therefore he'd be blameless or whatever. It's not like that. Okay, so it is going to be a judgment. Um, in Exodus 7, a little bit later on, and here we start getting into the plagues, okay? And the fish in the Nile died. This is when it turns to blood. And the Nile stank, and so that the Egyptians could not drink the water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not even take this to heart. So, what you have here is you have a reason why his heart is being turned hard, right? It's because the magicians, his own magicians, do the same thing by their secret arts. And so it says, so Pharaoh's heart remained. Like remained hardened. And so like he it's kind of like he's like, well, my magicians can do this, so this doesn't prove anything, and he doesn't take it to heart. So we see kind of like we see kind of like the reason behind it. It's not arbitrary. This is something that like me and you can relate to. You're like, well, it could be God, but on the other hand, this also happens. So maybe it's not God. And if you're in heart of heart, you're just not going to listen. Okay. But we see behind the scenes a little bit there, or we see the reason, I should say, why he's hardened. Exodus 8, verse 13. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. This is the plague of frogs. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields, and they gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, in other words, like he was getting a break, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Okay. So like here again we see like a reason. He sees like, well, it's not the end of the world, this is easing up, and so he hardens his own heart. And here it emphasizes he hardened his heart, but it also says as the Lord had said. And you're thinking, wait a minute, the Lord said that he was going to harden Pharaoh's heart, but it tells you that the understanding that Moses had is that Pharaoh was going to harden his own heart. You see what I'm saying? It's like as the reader, this catches your attention because you're going, as the Lord had said. Well, the Lord had said that he was going to harden Pharaoh's heart, but right here it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, and it's telling you pretty much it's the same thing, right? Or that it's an overlap. A bit later in that chapter, in verse 18, it says, the magicians tried by their secret arts to produce the gnats. This is the plague of gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. They're like, we can't do this. This is somebody else. You can't do this by magic, or we can't do this by our gods. This is the finger. This is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Now you're seeing that even though, before he may have had an excuse not to believe, and later on seen respite or whatever. Now he's being warned by his own magicians, hey, something deeper is going on here. But he's getting hardened to the point where like he's not even listening to them anymore. A bit later on in Exodus 8. And so Moses went out from Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord. And the Lord did as Moses asked and removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh and from his servants and from his people. Not one remained. So this is not the gnats, but this is the flies a little bit later on. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also and did not let the people go. So this time, Moses, like he basically, Pharaoh asked Moses to pray that this goes away. Moses prays to God that it goes away, and God is merciful. God actually removes the swarms of flies from Pharaoh and from his servants and from his people. But Pharaoh hardens his heart, and you know what? God knows that this is going to do, like, you can look at this either way. God gives you mercy on something, nothing happens, and we know that there's a tendency to be like, well, once the problem's gone, you kind of forget about God, or you're like, and so that's kind of part of like where Pharaoh's at. The other thing though is that that like God relenting is going to harden Pharaoh's heart. So God is acting in a way that, like others would respond, thank God for his mercy, he took the flies away and I'm going to follow him, right? But he knows Pharaoh's heart already. And he's like, if I do this type of person, Pharaoh, is going to harden his heart and just forget about me and just forget about, and say, well, it's okay. That problem's gone. And I'm just not going to I'm just not going to listen to God anymore, right? We've been on both sides of this equation, by the way, each one of us. So Exodus 9. And the next day the Lord did this thing. All the livestock, this is the plague of livestock dying, right? All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one of the livestock of the people of Israel died. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, not one of the livestock of Israel was dead. Now God is like showing off a little bit, like, like this is only happening in the land of Egypt, but like living among you in the land of Goshen is like these Israelites, none of their livestock are dead. Your livestocks are all dead, like take a hint, right? And Pharaoh sent, and behold, not one of the livestock of Israel was dead, but the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. So he's like, check to see if the livestock of the Israelites are dead. And he gets a report, and it's like, yeah, no, they're all alive. And still he's gone, no, I'm not. He didn't let the people go. So he's this is more of a and here we have was hardened. Okay. Verse 11, the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. This is the plague of boils. For the boils came upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. So here you finally again have that phrase, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had spoken to Moses. Remember last time we said, as the Lord had spoken to Moses, was when we saw that Moses had hardened his own heart. So it's, yeah, Pharaoh hardened. Last time that we heard that phrase, as the Lord had spoken to Moses, was after Pharaoh had said, had hardened his own heart. So this time it's the Lord hardening the heart of Pharaoh. Verse 33 of chapter 9. So Moses went out of the city from Pharaoh and stretched out his hands to the Lord, and the thunder and the hail ceased. This is the plague of hail and thunder. And the rain no longer poured upon the earth. But when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned yet again and hardened his heart, he and his servants, so that the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people of Israel go, just as the Lord had spoken through Moses. So the scriptures putting the blame squarely on Pharaoh here. It's Pharaoh's sin again and hardened his heart. So it's Pharaoh hardening his heart, and it's the writer's telling you he's doing this repeatedly. So repeatedly he's hardening his heart. Okay, and then the next sentence. So the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and it's kind of like, okay, that's that in between kind of statement where it's like, is it God? Is it God hardening Pharaoh's heart? Is Pharaoh doing it? And the answer is yes. Yeah. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants." So now God is hardening the hearts of his servants. Okay, that I may show these signs of mine among them. And he's giving you a reason, like he's building this up. They're hardening their hearts, and I am going to show these signs. This is going to glorify me. A little bit later in verse 18, it says, "So he went out from Pharaoh and pleaded with the Lord, and the Lord turned the wind into a very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea." Remember our east wind thing? The east wind brings the locusts, the west wind gets rid of them. And so a little side note, the east, we always see this thing from the east, where like in scripture, it's associated with bad things, or like calamity and stuff like that. Now the west wind is reversing them. Okay. But which lifted the locusts and drove them into the Red Sea. Not a single locust was left in all the country of Egypt, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go. A little bit later in chapter 10, then Pharaoh called Moses and said, "Go serve the Lord. Your little ones also go with you. Let your flocks and your herds remain behind." But Moses said, "You must also let us have sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Our livestock also must go with us. Not a hoof shall be left behind us, for we must take them to serve the Lord our God, and we do not know with what we must serve the Lord until we arrive there." This really what happens is that when Moses first goes to Pharaoh, he doesn't say, "Let my people go and just free us, and we're going to run to another country and never come back again." He's telling Moses, he's telling Pharaoh, "Let my people go so that we may worship in the wilderness." That's all that he's bargaining. So like Pharaoh's like, well, now he's kind of like letting go a little bit. The pressure's on. And he's like, but your livestock stays here. He doesn't. He even does. Like they're kind of starving for livestock because all their livestock's dead. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. Then Pharaoh said to him, "Get away from me. Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die." Moses said, "As you say, I will not see your face again." So Pharaoh is like going, "Don't even dare to come into my courts again. If you ever see my face again, I'll kill you." And Moses is saying, "It's just as you say, I will never see your face again, because we're going to be out of here." Kind of side note. "And all these servants shall come down to me and bow down to me." Well, this is God talking to Moses. It says, "All these servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, 'Get out, you and all the people who follow you. And after that, I will go out.'" Actually, this is Moses talking. And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. Hot nose. Evan knows what I'm talking about. "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Pharaoh will not listen to you, that my wonders,'" huh? Hot nostrils. Yeah, that's yeah. Well, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Pharaoh will not listen to you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt.' Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go out of his land." Exodus 14. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get the glory over for Pharaoh and all his hosts, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. A bit later in the same chapter, and the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. So now we're getting solidly into uh, um, the reiteration of the phrase that it's God hardening Pharaoh's heart, right? And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. That's kind of like perhaps another reason why his heart is being hardened. They're going out, but they're also going out defiantly, and that makes him angry. It's like these, they're not like, oh, thank you for letting us go and we're going out in the desert and, whatever. No, the Israelites are leaving defiantly. They're like, yeah, forget you, Pharaoh. And Pharaoh doesn't like that. And he's like, oh, yeah, I want to go. So it's another reason why his heart is being hardened. Another kind of like, let's just say natural reason. He doesn't like the fact that like they're kind of like saying, forget you, Pharaoh. We're going out defiantly, and he doesn't like that. So God is telling Moses here in verse 16, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so they will go in after them. And I will get the glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts. Hosts actually is probably their gods, It could include that, not just his physical army, but it definitely includes his physical army, and that may be all it is. But I will get the glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots, and his horsemen. So now hardness turns into foolishness, because he's going to go into the water that's standing up. And you got to think, well, why would he do that? It's like, if he's seeing the wonders of God on, like, and he's got his entire, and the army of their armies are like on dry ground in the middle of the Red Sea with the water stacked on both sides, chasing the Israelites, right? What makes them think that they can do that and get by with it? Because the only way that these waters are standing is because of the work of Yahweh, right? So now it's there. Now it's just foolhardiness. Now it's just like crossed over into just complete. They're just being completely foolish now. Oh, I missed something here.
Nice chart we have.
I did have a nice chart going, and there was a main thing here I missed. I will harden the hearts of Egyptians so they'll go.
I don't. It doesn't bother me, but. No, it doesn't bother me. I don't have my glasses. I don't have my glasses, so I could.
Okay, let's go back. But the Lord, at the beginning of the end of chapter 9, I believe it is. Okay, so let's go back to chapter 9. This is, I caught this kind of last moment, and I forgot to write a note about it. In verse 34 here, it says, but when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder ceased, he sinned yet again and hardened his heart, he and his servants. Okay, there it's that he sinned yet again and hardened his heart, he and his servants. And then the next chapter, it's basically the about the next sentence afterwards. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants. Okay, so here it says, he sinned yet again and hardened his heart, he and his servants. Him and his servants are hardening their hearts, right? And right when we're told that, right after that, the Lord says to Moses, go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his hearts and the heart of his servants. It's basically telling you that it's the same thing, you know? So, like I've heard some people say, well, sometimes Pharaoh hardened his own heart, sometimes God hardened his heart. That may be true, but in this case, at least, it's the same thing. Okay. So I thought that's remarkable because he's talking about the same event. So yeah, let's look at this. The 10 plagues in Pharaoh's heart. So we have the introduction, of course, that, and then after that, you see these first plagues. The blood became heart, frogs hardened his heart, gnats was heart, flies hardened his own heart, dead livestock, Pharaoh's heart was hard. It wasn't until the boils where it starts being emphasized, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then hail, it says hardened his own heart, locusts hardened his own heart, darkness hardened, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and firstborn die, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So there's a progression in hardening, and this is kind of like where it kind of like hits home for us, because a lot of times we fall into sin, and whenever we sin repeatedly or fall into sin repeatedly, it's because our hearts are hard. We're not listening to God, and we're being hard, right? So at first, Pharaoh is hardened because he sees the other magicians matching the miracles. So God may warn us or start, putting a check in us, but it's in a way that can be, quote, explained away, right? Well, I don't know if that was really God, you know? Um, so it's kind of like, it's no big thing has happened yet, or hasn't become that big of a deal yet. You don't think, and you just go, I don't know if God's really talking to me about this or not, or you just kind of, or you ignore it, right? After that, he's hardened because God is merciful and relenting. God is easing up, and he sees that like, that there's respite, right? So that's when I said, when bad things go away, you forget about God. God is merciful to you. You don't really get like the consequences of your action. And at first, you might even be thankful about that. But you either start ignoring it after a while, or because of that, you become hard-hearted and you just ignore God. Um, and Then he gets hardened to a point that he even starts to ignore his magician's warnings. So it's even the ungodly are starting to suggest to you that, like, this is beyond normal, dude. You're screwing up. It's like, you can't go on like this. It doesn't even have to be your Christian friends or whatever. It's his own magician saying, like, this is not us doing this. This is not normal. This is beyond. This is beyond. Okay, for them it was like, this has got to be the work of this Yahweh. Um, and But still, like, you're getting worse, right? And you're getting harder. Eventually, Pharaoh hits a rock bottom. And this is the point many of us have to come to, is hitting a rock bottom. For him, it's the loss of his own son. And he finally does something. And for some people, they're hard up until this point and then hit rock bottom. And then that's what finally shakes them awake. And they go, oh my gosh, what have I done? You know, and it's like in I do sound for Celebrate Recovery. And you hear story after story after story of people's progression into addiction or whatever else, just hurts, hangups, and them finally getting to a point where they hit rock bottom. And when they hit rock bottom, it wakes them up and they start, like, clinging to God in that time. But for every story that you have of that, I'm sure there's stories of that people still go on. They hit rock bottom and they go on until they die, or they go on until, like, the point of no return or something. So with Pharaoh, he keeps on going. Um, but he hits a bottom there with the loss of his son. And ultimately, Pharaoh becomes so foolhardy that he gets his entire army wiped out. His army becomes so foolish and foolhardy that they get themselves killed. He loses everything and they lose their lives, you know. So sometimes it comes all the way to that. And that's kind of like the progression in hardening. You've gotten so beyond the point of ever listening again that you're just going to continue no matter what. So we have some conclusions here, and the summary of Pharaoh's hardening is that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. You know, that's the overall point of view here in the story. But even so, Pharaoh is often recorded as hardening his own heart. And in Exodus 9:34 and 10:1, they are the same thing. So you know, like it's where the writers again like to blur those lines so that you're like, where does God's sovereignty end and people's what's Pharaoh's free will and what's God's sovereignty, and it's both. It's yes, right? It's that blurring of the lines that like these Hebrew writers like to, um, um, you know, like but they love it. Yeah, they do it all. They do it very often.
It's the very long conversations.
Yeah, yeah,
One verse.
yeah, it does. Also, at times we see that the circumstances that lead to Pharaoh's hardening, we see kind of we could see why he's actually being hardened. So, but you can't say that Pharaoh's heart is hardened against his will. It's not as if God's saying, and Pharaoh's going, I don't want my heart to be hard. And God's going, well, I'm going to make it hard anyway. You can't really say that. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart begins with a heart that is already predisposed to hardening. God knows that Pharaoh is going to harden his heart. And as the saying goes, haters are going to hate, you know, and God will just use that. It's like, okay, you've made up your mind the way you're going to be. I know what you're like, and I know that you're not going to get better. So you know what? I'll help you, and I'm going to use whatever, you know, like I'm going to use that to my own glory, some way, you know. So the same circumstances, you know, that Pharaoh went through would have turned a softer heart towards God. Most of us are going, Pharaoh, come on, man, wake up at some point. And I think that like there's a softer heart would have said, you know, like, no, I've seen these plagues and this is the hand of God. Even the magicians at one point, you know, even though they hardened themselves later on, at one point they were kind of like, this isn't us anymore. You know, we can't do this. This is the hand of God. Yeah. So God seems to have led Pharaoh more and more into a hardness that he was predisposed towards. It's kind of like the conclusion there. And God used his Pharaoh's own hardness against him, but more importantly, he used Pharaoh's hardness to his own glory. And and we'll talk about some more examples of God hardening and more verses of that. And in fact, even like Jesus, when if you think about it, when he used parables, and you're thinking, why is Jesus using parables if people are going to be blind, and you know, and we'll get into some of that a bit later. But that's kind of like uh, you know, a good look at like a Pharaoh's story here, and we can see, you know, again that interplay between um, God's sovereignty over evil and even using evil for His own glory. It's just another other example of that, you know, and I know that there's been a big discussion between like Calvinists and Armenians, and there's you know, when you get to the extremes on either one of them, you can end up with some strange, you know, things that don't really make sense. And I think that like, and I'm glad that we you know, like saw more examples before today of that blurring of the lines, um, that that we saw with especially with the with the Trinity and stuff like that, so that you're going, oh, this is another example of the way that these biblical Hebrew writers like to write. You know. So, anybody have any questions or comments or anything?
No, I'm just gonna point that the word to make hard is the word kazak. It's like to make stronger.
Make stronger,
Or
yeah.
to fortify what was already there.
Okay.
So it kind of like lends itself toward that. There's another word like kasha, which is like to make severe or make like stiff, like stiff neck people. But it's not that word.
Okay.
It's like to fortify something that's already strong.
So did you catch that? There's the word in Hebrew that we're using for harden is to fortify and make stronger. So so yeah, that's along the lines of like Pharaoh had a hard heart, God made it harder, and that's kind of like the along that idea, So
I was expecting a different word.
You're expecting,
and then when I checked
the stiff necked, yeah, that's a different word for like where the Israelites hardened their heart into but they had stiff necks. But this is a different word, is to fortify, um, Pharaoh's hardness, pre-existing hardness. So he.
So like, it's not so much that when you put it that way, it's not like God said, I'm just going to harden his heart. It was already there, but because of the experience that he was going through, it caused it to be hardened.
Yeah.
The experience that God was
taking
him through. So
right.
It's not, does that make sense what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that makes better sense, because you almost make it sound like, well, then there's an example that man isn't in control. It's just not. No,
yeah.
He wasn't. Pharaoh, what did have that choice? But because of going through it,
right.
It hardened it more.
Right. So like I saw this. I saw like a picture of like God going zap and to Pharaoh's heart, and all of a sudden it was like hardened, right? And like I don't know if they were trying to be funny or if that's like the way that decided, God went zap. That's kind of like what we picture. But then when you read the story, you're going, like God is like bringing about circumstances that he knows how Pharaoh's going to react to those, and so we see like glimpses of that, like he does something that like he knows, God knows that like his magicians can at least fake the blood in the Nile sort of thing, or the water, right? um maybe it's a fake, maybe they can genuinely do this with their magic arts, I don't know, right? um but they can replicate it in any case, and he knows that if that happens, Pharaoh's just going to be like, you know and he starts with that, and you see this progression of like you could actually see like, oh, okay, and then you know that like when you have respite and the bad is gone, that you're kind of like, you just kind of like, you can ignore God or whatever. So you see that like, God kind of builds things up and lets Pharaoh get harder and harder, but he also introduces those things. So there's never really like an explicit thing, at least in the story. And I'm not saying that it's impossible that God did that, but but he holds Pharaoh completely accountable for his hardness of heart. So it tells you that like, no, Pharaoh's responsible for this. Pharaoh is responsible for this.
That's
so
just free will.
yeah, right. He's not. I don't think that you have like an interference of free will here.
Right.
But we will run into like some things that Paul says, especially, that you're going, how much is how much is it free will, or like he says, can can the potter? Well, we'll talk about that next week, you know. But there's things yeah, right, yeah, yeah. We'll get into that. We'll get into Romans 9. So yeah, we'll get into Romans 9. But yeah, it's one thing at a time. And here with this story, you see, you know, like at least the building blocks of God's sovereignty and the hardening of hearts. Yeah. Okay, I'll talk to you
Thank
guys
you.
next week. Okay, you're welcome. See you later.
Have a good
Bye.
week, everybody.
Bye. Bye.